we had to sue the Army, and we had all our consultants quit and said, this is just the most ridiculous thing. You'll never you can't sue your customer, and you definitely can't sue the Army. And
all right, so in this video, we're going to break down how Palantir sued the U.S. Army and won a $100 million contract in the process. So I got a couple of clips here of a conversation between Peter Thiel and Joe Lonsdale, both co-founders of Palantir. People also know Peter Thiel as the founder of Founders Fund and the first outside investor in Facebook. So we're going to break down why Palantir sued, the Army burying documents, and some interesting insights that these guys have about the future of government and startups. So let's get into
all these and so in that context, you'd think, okay, there's some very big problem that can be solved. It in some ways it turned out to be more difficult than one would have thought. There obviously are all these sectors we have that are very, very broken, where education, healthcare, all these sort of deeply broken sectors where the solution, there's some obvious solutions, and the fact they have not been implemented tells you there's some big barriers to implementation.
They're set up not to allow you to break them. This is kind of what I think of
with the Palantir version. Is there was this I forget what the acronym stands for. There was this software program. This was once we moved from intelligence community into the broader military, called DSIGs, which was sort of this. In theory, was a system where you're supposed to figure out ways to integrate the data across all these units in the field and headquarters, and integrate what was going on, which is an incredibly important thing to do. In practice, it was sort of a kludgy consultant billion-dollar boondoggle that didn't work, and we naturally thought we would replace it in 6 months, and it took something like 10 years.
All right, so to give some context here, what Peter's talking about with DSIG stands for Distributed Common Ground System. So basically, this was something the Army was building to integrate battlefield intelligence, satellite data, drone footage, you name it, into a single platform to make decisions. Now, the problem was this project got kicked off in the early 2000s, and they spent about $6 billion on it by 2013. So it was not a success. What Palantir does is tailor-made for this type of problem, but he's going to get into why they had some issues with the Army, and again, why they had to file their lawsuit. So let's kick it off.
You can't sue your customer, and you definitely can't sue the Army. And not only will you not get them as a customer, you will not get anybody else in DC. You'll just be blackballed by everybody. And then and it was under it was in 2016 that we sued them. It was under a 1994 law where the military was supposed to have an open procurement process, and then what you can do when you sue somebody is you get discovery, and you sort of discover what's going on in the sausage making factory that no one's investigated for 22 years, and there's a lot of stuff, and there was sort of there were internal reports that Palantir worked better, which didn't matter because obviously nobody can assess the software. But then more scandalously, there were orders to suppress the reports. There were emails that people had to hide the findings, and there was a cover-up. And this did not sound like the open procurement process. And then you won at the court level, then you won at the district at the DC circuit level, and they were forced to reopen the process. And then after a decade, we sort of got the contract. So so there was something that was doable, but it was not as straightforward as it sounded.
Right. So here's where Peter starts to get into the reason behind Palantir's lawsuit. So again, the Army had already invested a lot of money in this D6 project, and Palantir was already working with other agencies to do similar data management projects. So on June 30th, 2016, Palantir ultimately filed the lawsuit claiming that the Army was violating federal procurement law. Specifically, there's requirements for agencies to first consider commercially off-the-shelf software like Palantir and other big enterprise software providers before you actually go on a development or build path to build something yourself. So when Palantir had gone through diligence and they weren't being considered, they started to learn later on in Discovery that the Army had actually been burying internal reports. They'd been burying emails that confirmed that Palantir was capable of doing this, that they were actually superior to DSIGs and the internal builds. But ultimately, again, officials and bureaucracy was just keeping Palantir out of the agency. So on October 31st, 2016, the court actually ruled in Palantir's favor, and the judge called out the Army's failure to follow the procurement law and issued an injunction. They had to reopen the bidding process and fairly evaluate Palantir's solution, which ultimately led to a $100 million contract for Palantir with the U.S. Army. So you got to say it's a pretty baller move to sue the Army and then make them pay you $100 million. But you'll also hear shortly that they weren't the first ones to actually do this. There was another popular company that set this precedent before. So let's jump back into it and hear that, and then we'll kind of wrap up.
Feels like there's these, and SpaceX had to sue as well, of course. It feels like there's these parts of our society that are set up to just maintain their broken nature, and you have to just punch really, really, really hard through them. And it's very rare people do that, you know?
Yeah, SpaceX was the first successful template to do it. And there's, there's obviously something like this. The university system seems as broken or more than the military procurement process, and then especially with the accrediting agencies and all these things where they just are designed to prevent newcomers, and it's like if you actually had a newcomer, they would just eat the field or whatever.
They try to crush you. They try to crush you. It took us thousands of pages of regulation. But
I think there was an Elon metaphor he told me once, and this was like I remember when, but it was like maybe 2010, 2011. And it was sort of like there were these 3 or 4 aerospace companies in the U.S. that were like really badly managed and badly run, and it was sort of they were these very fat cows on this grassy enclosed field, and if you ever got in there was just going to be a bloodbath.
Oh yeah.
So it was kind of
it's like you're he's like
metaphor.
this carnivore, and there's a big fence, and you gotta climb this really big fence.
Yes.
Eventually you get in there. Yes. It's gonna be so this is a very optimistic.
Right. So you heard it there. I didn't know about this, but SpaceX had actually in 2014 sued the U.S. Air Force over essentially similar anti-competitive practices where, they were giving the legacy providers all the contracts despite SpaceX doing it cheaper, more effectively. So that lawsuit was actually settled in January 2015 as well. And SpaceX was officially allowed to compete for military contracts from that point. So again, really interesting to see sort of the history of startups in working with these government agencies. So the other thing I thought was also really interesting was their analogy of a fat cow in a pasture. So it's all these industries like again, government agencies, legacy industries that we've all seen like banking, etc. There's so many incumbents and so much bureaucracy that a lot of them become super stale, and there's a huge opportunity for startups and outsiders. So I thought that was a very apt analogy and really interesting perspective from both Peter and Joe. And clearly it's worked for them, right? They've been massively successful, and everyone knows Palantir's been doing extremely well of late. So I think these guys are onto something. In any case, if you're still watching, thank you so much. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit that like button, consider subscribing, and if you want more strategic takes on business and technology, come back to the channel. This is Boardroom Wire. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.